It's good to be here. So, just want to give a couple announcements as we get started tonight. A few things, actually quite a few things coming up in the next few days. So, just want to keep these in front of us so we're aware. We got the annual meeting coming up. So, annual congregational meeting and communion. So, communion will be right after the morning service, as we normally do this Sunday. And then after that, we'll have our annual business meeting for members, just where we talk about the year and approve the budget and things like that. If you are a member, you should have seen an email, hopefully, that went out earlier today with the online absentee ballot for the election of church officers. So we have absentee ballots available here in the building if you need one, or you can vote online absentee, and the in-person vote will be during our annual meeting. And that's just, if you recall, when we voted on the deacons back in December, we typically vote on other officers like clerk and missions committee members and Christian education committee members and such. And we weren't quite ready for that, so we didn't vote on those at that point, so we're voting on them now. So we've already voted on the deacons, now we're voting on the other officers. And so just be aware of that. These are volunteer positions. They serve for 1 or 2 year terms, depending on how it's set up, and they just serve as kind of auxiliary to the leadership, basically as having more than one eye on different things, on different ministries like Christian education and missions, I think is a good thing. The clerk, I think you probably realize what clerk does, but they take notes from the congregational meetings, which is a great thing to do. So if you ever have a desire to be a clerk, let us know. We usually have to turn down a lot of people that want to do that. So anyways, these are all volunteer ministry positions, and we're grateful for these people that are being willing to serve. And so that's one of the items. And then we'll be voting on the budget. There'll be an explanation of that as well. So just be aware of that coming up. There's a membership class. So for those interested in formal membership at Evangel, and that'll be next Sunday at 6 p.m. It's a class that's very informal. Pastor Larry teaches it. It's sort of a more of a dialogue, but he definitely has things he likes to get through or wants to get through in that, kind of who we are, what we believe, where we've come from, what we expect out of members. If you're partnering together with us officially as a member, what's expected there. And we just want to encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in, although not quite sure yet, that's totally fine. You don't need to be sure that you're going to become a member to take the class. It's totally fine just to take it and to kind of figure that out, all right? So that's coming up next Sunday at 6 p.m. The following Sunday, January 28th, is our winter family fun night. So we're hanging out just informally here in the building, and we're going to have food potluck style, so bring soup or something that you like to eat. I think we're kind of making a soup/chili theme, but really whatever you'd like to bring and share. And we'll have games. If you want to bring some board games, we'll have some games set up in the Upper Fellowship Hall for young people or older people, anyone that wants to play. And it's just a good time, especially, we used to do them all during the summer, and then last year we added one during the winter in January, and it was good. So looking forward to that. Finally, we have coming up our ministry with the Warming Center with ChristNet. And so Pastor Jerry is heading that up. There's opportunities to serve in the first full week in February, so February 4th through the 11th. We have need of people to help with food service, people that are willing to spend the night or even stay overnight for that. And so there are sign-ups. There's a sign-up, I think, out in the lobby maybe right now. Okay. And Pastor Jerry is your mobile sign-up. You just find him and tell him how you want to serve. So we have a number already, which is encouraging, but we're always looking for more help with that. So the Warming Center, in case you're not familiar, is just we're partnering with ChristNet, a local foundation in our community that helps people that are experiencing that are homeless at the moment, right? And we, along with other churches, we take a week and house them for a week. So they'll be staying here at the church at nights, and we feed them dinner every night as well. All right, so those are the kind of the breakdown of things that are coming up at Evangel, just so that you're aware of that. All right, we're going to jump back into the book of Ecclesiastes, and we kind of covered the introduction to the book last week, and we looked at chapter 1. Ecclesiastes is the one that says vanity of vanities. That is correct. All right, and we took a look at what that means, and we're going to get into especially chapter 2 tonight. All right, so why don't we open in a word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Father, we love you and we thank you. Thank you for your word that you've given to us. Thank you that we can understand it and know it. I pray that you would give us hearts that want to honor you in the way that we understand your word, that you would help us to be diligent in studying it so that we might be pleasing to you. Thank you for Jesus Christ. Thank you for the work that he did on the cross, and it's only because of his saving work that we can come before you tonight. And so we thank you for our Savior. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so just a quick review of some of the things that we looked at last week. We talked about the author and the title specifically, and how the title of the book is connected to the author. So we have right at the beginning of the book the words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, right? And if you think Ecclesiastes is a funny title for a book, it's just the Greek translation of the original Hebrew word for preacher, right? And we said that it kind of reminds us of the word for church, right? Ecclesia, if you're familiar with kind of the biblical language lingo, that might ring a bell. And the connection there is that this is a person that gathers people together to teach. And that's why he's called the preacher here, right? He's someone that gathers people together to instruct. And if you think about the word church, it's the gathering, right? And so that's that relation there. That's why we call the book Ecclesiastes. It's the author, the preacher. Who is this preacher? Well, we have a lot of clues, right? In chapter 1, verse 1, right away you see that he's the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, I know in the original language, son of David didn't necessarily mean the immediate son, but here's some more clues, right? 1, verse 12, he says he's king again in Israel over Jerusalem. 1, verse 16, he says, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who are over Jerusalem before me. Starting to ring some bells, right? Chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. So I became great. No problem. I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. So this is someone with great wisdom and also great prosperity, right? So we're starting to sound a lot like someone we know, right? And then in Ecclesiastes 12, verse 9, near the end, he says, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing, studying, and arranging many proverbs with great care. It's a safe bet to say that this is Solomon, right? That this is the reflections of King Solomon, the son of David, with possible a later editor coming in and compiling his works and having a little introduction in that first verse and a little kind of summing up in the last few verses of Ecclesiastes. All right. Then we kind of talked about the main point of what he's trying to do, and this is found in Ecclesiastes 1, verses 12 through 14. I think kind of gives us this initial main theme of the book. He says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. All right, and so we talked about how to interpret some of these ideas. So this word that's translated vanity is literally just the word for breath. And so some commentators, some that have made kind of original translations as they worked through the text, they suggest something like breath of breaths, right? Life is transient. So it communicates the transient nature of life, the idea of life as a vapor. It comes and goes. One of the commentators said this: breathe in, now breathe out. Life is like that, right? Life passes by just that quickly. But the idea of vapor also can convey something of an enigma. So you could think of it like this, utterly enigmatic, says the preacher. Everything is enigmatic. It's hard to understand. So those are the concepts of this phrase that repeats over and over again, this word we translate vanity. The author is looking at life under the sun, or life under heaven. So he's restricting kind of his scope of his research to this mortal life, if you will, this life here on earth that's passing away. But he does it from the perspective of God. He goes to great lengths to show throughout the book that he's drawing conclusions based on God. He said in chapter 1, verse 13, God has given these things. The one we're going to look at tonight, chapter 2, verses 24 through 26, he says that these things are from the hand of God. Chapter 3 says the business that God has given to the children of man to stay busy with. And in chapter 7, verse 14, in the day of prosperity be joyful, in the day of adversity consider God has made the one as well as the other. Okay, so he's setting out to figure out this life under the sun, and there's going to be some autobiography going on here. He's going to say, I did a lot of these things, and there's going to be some negativity there that he's going to reflect on. We'll see some of that tonight. But then he'll always come back and give a conclusion that I think that we should take heed to. One of the things I want to just circle back to in a little bit different way is there's a couple different ways to we want to be biblically faithful, and there's a couple ways that people that still have a high view of Scripture, that consider the Bible to be God's Word and authoritative and without error, a couple ways that they approach the book. And I just want to go over those real quick. One of them is the preacher as a foil, okay? And so if you're a literature buff and you kind of understand these things, I had to look it up because I'm not as big of a literature buff, but what's the idea of a foil in literature? In literature, a foil character is a character that's presented in contrast to the main character, right? And the point of introducing that character is to highlight, by contrast, the main character's qualities, okay? So here's some ideas. What's a famous foil? I would say Dr. Watson is a famous foil to Sherlock Holmes, right? So what's the point of having Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories? I mean, you could argue for a lot of it, but I think a big part of it is just to highlight the difference between Sherlock and a normal human being, right? He was the foil. It's like we see ourselves a lot in Dr. Watson. Like, I wouldn't have gotten that either, right? If you're a fan of Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet's sisters act as foils to her character, right? She's the one that is she has good virtue, and her sisters not so much, right? Or so I've heard. So they tell me. All right. So some people want to read the Bible, especially read Ecclesiastes, as this is the example. As you read the whole book, this is the example of that we don't want to follow, right? This is how not to think. So as you read through the book, this is in contrast to other wisdom literature like Proverbs or Psalms, right? And this is a common way of approaching Ecclesiastes. And so in other words, he stands, the preacher is the foil, and he stands in contrast to the rest of the Bible. It's not the right way to think. It's a cautionary example of how not to think that highlights the goodness of the right way to think. So you would interpret something like, when we talked about that phrase, vanity of vanities, something along the lines of meaninglessness or absurd. It kind of approaches this nihilistic kind of idea. There's no meaning at all. You're also forced to interpret some of these positive teachings, one of which we're going to look at tonight, sprinkled through the book as essentially lost man's last-ditch effort to understand or get something out of this life. Okay? The main problem I have with this approach is that I don't think that understanding it this way is obvious. I don't think it's obvious that the preacher is a foil, that we're not supposed to take him seriously. Nowhere in Ecclesiastes does the preacher correct this teaching. If these conclusions he's drawing through the book, if we're not supposed to take those as being right, you would think he would correct them somewhere, but he doesn't. if you do take chapter 12, the final chapter of the book, as a correction, standing in contrast as the main body of the book, why would he kind of correct it, but then close with that phrase, vanity of vanities? So let's look at Ecclesiastes 12, where he goes, that famous, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, and all that. And he says in verse 6, before the silver cord is snapped, the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. You think, okay, great way to end, right? But then he goes back. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. You're thinking if he was correcting his point of view, that he wouldn't end with that statement that he started with, right? So one of the other things we didn't talk about last week, but is at the beginning, if you want to go back to Ecclesiastes 1, verse 13, some take that verse 13, we'll just read it real quick. He says, I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business. Does any other translations here in the room have anything other than unhappy, an unhappy business? Burdensome task, okay. Grievous, yeah. Good. There's there's actually an element of the idea of evil here. So you could actually translate it. It's an evil task. It's an evil business that God has given us to the children of man to be busy with. And so people take that and say, basically Solomon is setting this book up and saying, I'm calling God evil, right? And he's presenting this right from the outset. He's signaling that he's presenting the book from an unbelieving standpoint. Problem I have with this, first of all, is evil is not the only way to translate it. Troubled or unhappy is perfectly good. Second, I want to take you to another place that uses something very similar to this. So Job chapter 2, and just by comparison, because Job's going to use the same word here in Job chapter 2. We're familiar with the story of the book of Job, right? The devil comes and God allows him to afflict Job, right? And he takes away all his wealth, and then he comes back to God. He says, well, he still only worships you because he still has his health with him. So God says, okay, you can take away his health, but don't kill him, right? Basically. And so the devil takes away everything that Job has, all of his loved ones, and afflicts him to the point, just basically an inch of his death, and he's sitting in dust and ashes, right? And look what we see in Job 1:20. It says, Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And then, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Then Satan comes back and he says, no, he still has his health, so then he takes away his health. Now let's go down to Job 2, verse 10. Verse 9. His wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Right? Like you're almost dead anywhere. You've lost everything. You're sick. Just be done with it. Just curse God and die. Right? It says, but he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not also receive? Now the ESV says evil, right? You might have something like trouble. This is the same word, okay? And so you might say, oh, well then, was Job calling God evil? Well, let's read on. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips, right? So we can't say that Job was calling God evil here. He said very clearly, if we receive good from the Lord, we also have to learn to receive evil or trouble or difficulty or from the Lord. And this very clearly was not a wrong thing to say, right? And so I would say similarly, in the outset of Ecclesiastes, I don't think that it's right to say the preacher is saying something wrong here. He's saying something very similar to what Job is saying. God gives man oftentimes an unhappy business to be about in this world. And it's a difficult thing to understand. It's a vanity of vanities, like striving after wind. All right? but he's setting out his heart to understand it. So if we shouldn't understand the preacher as a foil, I would suggest we should understand him as a wise man of God. I think the way to understand Ecclesiastes is to take the preacher, first of all, as who he claims to be, which is a man of wisdom. Chapter 1, verse 13 again. Search out by wisdom. And he says in Ecclesiastes 2:9, also my wisdom remained with me. And he says things like that all throughout the book. And then also a man who, in addition to this book, also taught other things and wrote other proverbs. I think it's really interesting how Ecclesiastes closes with maybe this editor that's taken the words of Solomon. He said, in addition to being wise, right? Again, if the editor were trying to correct what Solomon was saying, you wouldn't think he would say something like, in addition to being wise. You'd think he'd say something like, check out his Proverbs, to get the true thing, right? But he says, in addition, besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. Not only to take him for what he claims to be, but also to understand his teaching to be normative, that we should take to accept his conclusions throughout the book as good conclusions and good ways to consider life. Even if it's a bit dark, especially on a January in the dead of winter, even if it tends to be negative, God gave it to us for a reason, and so we should study it. All right, so I want to start kind of working this approach to Ecclesiastes out, and we're going to start in chapter 2 with this so that we can see how it works out. If we approach the book this way, how that would work out. Some have suggested that a good way to kind of structure the book of Ecclesiastes is to point out what can be called the enjoyment refrains. Some call them the carpe diem, the seize the day kind of ideas, but it's seven of these refrains that basically commend enjoyment, appropriate enjoyment, as something that God's given to us during this life. All right? And they seem to set off different themes in the book. The first one comes right at the end of chapter 22, of chapter 2, and so we're going to be looking through chapter 2 together tonight. So the theme of this first section is what I'm going to call the heart searching for satisfaction. We've already gotten this kind of main purpose idea at the beginning in chapter 1, where he said, I have applied my heart to seek and to search out. Now we're going to see that idea repeated quite a bit as kind of a signal that he's starting this search. He says in verse 16, I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom. He says in verse 17, I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And then starting in verse 1 of chapter 2, he says again, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So in this search for satisfaction, where he's starting to put into practice this purpose statement that he gave us, he's going to run some tests, all right? So he says, I said in my heart, I'm going to test you with pleasure. So that's his first test in this heart that's searching for satisfaction. In verses 1 through 11, it says, but behold, this also was vanity, right? I'm going to test you with pleasure, my inner being with pleasure, but behold, this was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? And then he says, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. So now it's not just trying my inner being at pleasure, but now it's my body. How can I test my body with pleasurable things like wine? Interesting phrase here. He says, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. It's like he makes a point to say, I tried out these pleasurable things like wine, but I was still wise with it. I was still guiding my heart with wisdom. And how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to under heaven during the few days of their life. That phrase, lay hold on folly, I think we'll understand that a little bit better later, but I think it's the idea that he's trying to determine the things that are pleasurable and also avoid things that are folly, right? To lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. He says, I made great works. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold, the treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Right? So he's going crazy, right? He's engaged in building projects, community improvements. You think, and we can read, and I would encourage you to do that sometime, maybe this week if you have a chance, but to read 1 Kings 3 through 10 and 2 Chronicles 1 through 9 as passages that describe the beginning of the reign of Solomon and the I guess what we call the good portion of the reign of Solomon. And it's amazing the things that he's engaged in, ushering Israel into this kind of golden age, right? Or they look back after that and say, man, nothing was like that before. We never had this much prosperity. Silver was just almost throwing, you could throw it away, right? It was incredibly prosperous. Whatever he desired, he was able to get for himself. And it's interesting if you read that context of 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, this is during the time that he still appears to be following after God, right? Consider his prayer of dedication to the temple, right, during this time. I mean, if you read the prayer of Solomon in dedicating the temple, he appears to be following after God. Note his prayer, and that's in 1 Kings 11:1, that then we start seeing his downfall, right? And it's that infamous phrase, right? We've heard a lot, that he loved foreign women, right? He was drawn away by godless religions, by false gods, through intermarriage with other nations, right? But before then, he seems to be following after God. But he gives us insight into what was going on in his heart here in Ecclesiastes, I think, right? He's reaching out in all these activities and trying to find satisfaction in these projects, right? You can see that he's testing his heart with pleasure. He's saying, what can I get pleasure out of these things? And what is his first finding in this test? Look at verse 11 in Ecclesiastes 2. Then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. I think the first thing he's saying is this. He looked at all of this testing of pleasure, and his first finding was the effort outweighs the enjoyment. He's like, okay, I got some pleasure from this, but he said, I considered all that my hands had done and the toil I had expended in doing it. The work, the difficulty, and this word toil is going to come up over and over again. It just wasn't worth it. The effort outweighed the enjoyment. All right, now let's go on to his next test. And this is the test of wisdom in verse 12 through 17. So continuing on here, he says, I turned then to consider wisdom and madness and folly. And this phrase happens a few times as well. What does he mean by wisdom, madness, and folly? I think what he means here is basically this. We shouldn't think of it as three things necessarily as much as two things. There's wisdom on the one side, and then there's like the madness of the foolish life, madness and folly. And so I think what he's trying to do here is he's trying to search out and differentiate between good and evil, right? Between wisdom and folly and foolishness. Obviously, this is a big point of the Proverbs, right? We see that the contrast between the wise person and the fool, the wisdom and folly. So he's seeking out how to consider this. And it's interesting, even just from a human perspective, we know that everyone on the earth, I think, it would be a natural thing to assume, and we observe this around us, that people naturally have a concept of good and evil, right? Even if they reject God altogether, or they don't want anything to do with God, or don't maybe even think he exists, they typically have a concept of good and evil. They're willing to sit in judgment on some things, right? Even if they call the religious people judgmental, they're totally willing to sit in judgment on certain things. We all tend to do that. We also tend to approve certain things, right? We tend to consider certain things good. And Solomon here, wants to search these things out. He turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. I think he's saying this, right? I sought out pleasure. I did all these things that we just read about, and there's nothing else to do. Everyone that's coming after me, it's all going to be lesser than that. So now I'm turning to look at wisdom. He says this, I saw, in verse 13, then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks around in darkness. Yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. So his initial thought as he's starting to distinguish between wisdom and folly is he's making this distinction. There is a slight advantage to the wise person. He's able to see clearly. So when someone is able to come up to a good understanding of what is right and to be able to avoid the things that are wrong, they have their eyes in their head, right? They're able to see clearly, in contrast to the fool who walks around in darkness. All told, it's certainly better to know where you're going and have some measure of control than to be simply groping around in life, driven by whatever happens to come your way, right? But he quickly comes to another conclusion, even as he is separating wisdom and folly. He says this, and yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. What is this? I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also a vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. Right? So his findings here as he's testing out wisdom is this. Both the wise and the fool die, and they'll be forgotten. And he's following this up with the same thing he did in that first finding. It's all vanity. It's passing away, right? What happens to the fool still happens, is the same thing that happens to the wise man. What is his, oh, here, just real quick. This brings up this leveling effect that we again, I think kind of instinctively understand as humans as we live in this life, that everyone dies, right? And once that happens, there's no distinction. So think of it this way, the worst arm wrestler in the world, right, the weakest person in the world, could beat a dead arm wrestling champion at a game of arm wrestling, right? That's kind of obvious and also a little bit morbid, I'm sorry. But Solomon sort of says it the same thing, but he puts it this way. He says, a living dog is better than a dead lion, right? He says that later in Ecclesiastes. There's this leveling effect to death. You might think you have a lot of strength and a lot of ability to do a lot of great things. You have a lot of knowledge, but once you die, it doesn't matter. And so he's coming face to face with this reality of death as he's looking at life under the sun. Yeah?
Can we not look at this somewhat as the difference between man on a horizontal plane and then the vertical plane between you and God?
Yeah, I think we have to suspend it a little bit because we're still going to get to his conclusion. So this is a bit autobiographical, right? He's saying these things happened. So I think there is an element of that. But I'll suggest, too, that I think there's an element that we don't shy away from those realities either, even as believers, that we understand in this life there's an element of vanity to these things, even though we have the hope of eternity, right? That we don't discount those difficulties. But yes, he's gonna come to his conclusion here soon. That's good. So in this testing of wisdom, he comes to the conclusion that both the wise and the fool die. And as Solomon comes face to face with this prospect, he says, so I hated life, in verse 17, because what's done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after wind. But not only does he hate life itself, he hates the things that he has to do in life. So he hated my toil. And here's the third test in this heart searching for satisfaction, the testing of toil. Okay? This idea of toil, would any translations use a different word here instead of toil? Labor? Okay, good. Labor, anything else? It's the idea of not only hard work, but just really hard work, right? Think of Deuteronomy 26 is another place in the Old Testament that uses this word, and it's about the slavery of the people of Israel in Egypt, that they had toil under the Egyptians. Psalm 90, which we read last week, talks a lot about kind of remembering the temporary nature of life, but it talks about that this life is very short and is full of toil and trouble, right? Same word there. So it's this idea of difficult work. As Solomon moves to consider toil, we can also observe a reflection of Moses' account of the curse in Genesis 3. So I think that as Solomon's moving into this idea of looking at hard work, at toil, he's reflecting on, at least partially, the reality that we live in a cursed world. I think about Adam's portion of the curse that God gave to Adam. He says, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, this is in Genesis 3, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you are taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Right? So these ideas of work is going to be hard. You're going to have the sweat of your brow. You're not going to get the same returns as you would have. It's going to be difficult. And then it ends with this idea of it's going to end in death, right? Dust, to dust you shall return. And we're actually going to see Solomon echoing this dust idea a couple times later in Ecclesiastes as well. For now, he's just reflecting on this idea of toil, that work is hard. And he has two main findings in this test. The first one he's going to say is, you can't take it with you, right? He says, I hated my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. By the way, if this is Solomon, we know how it went with the men who came after him, right? Didn't go so well with Rehoboam. And Jeroboam got over half of all his stuff too, and it didn't go well with Jeroboam at all. And so he was right to be a little bit nervous about the people that he was going to leave all of his hard work and toil to, right? Yeah. Yes. It seems to be a universal thing, right? Yeah. That we understand that the things we're working for now can't ultimately satisfy. We can't take them with us, right? I think it's a universal also that, and to extent, but it seems like possibly men more than women often want to find a certain level of meaning in work, in profession. We take ownership of it, want it to count for something. And yet Solomon in his wisdom looked down the road to the end, and he saw he was going to have to hand his efforts off to someone else, right? And obviously with him we know how it turned out. But so it's again, to him, as he's trying to find satisfaction in his work, it's a bitterness because he can't find it ultimately in that. He's going to have to hand it off. And then the second finding is that toil is all-consuming for him. And I'll skip down real quick to 23. He says, for all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night, his heart does not rest. This is also a vanity. So it's wearing him out. And on top of that, when he's trying to rest from it, he can't get his mind off of it. Have you guys had that experience before? If you're working at something that's hard, maybe a conundrum, something you can't quite figure out, and when it goes to try to turn your mind off from it, to try to get some rest, sleep doesn't come. I think we've all maybe experienced that in certain ways and certain times, right? He's calling this a vanity, right? In this search after.
A lot of this area here, don't you think it troubled him because there was no answer or any way to change that part? That was like that's the way it was, and there was nothing his wisdom could change.
Yeah, I get the sense that he's again, going back to this testing of his heart, that he is looking at these three things and trying to find fulfillment ultimately in them, and that it's a misplaced, even if the activities themselves weren't wrong, the heart was going after them in a certain way that wasn't going to ultimately satisfy. And I think that's where we get to the correction that's coming up. Yeah?
If you deal with the idea of toil as labor, that which is done on the horizontal thing is going to be gone when you die.
Yeah.
But if you look at somebody like Paul,
Yeah.
he worked hard all of his life.
Yeah.
But what did he work for?
Mm-hmm.
He was looking at the vertical with God, and therefore he had his reward when he gets to heaven.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's, I wasn't sure exactly where that would fit in, but now that you brought it up, that's good. There are ways that we can be involved in a toil that is more than just for this life, right? When we're involved in serving in the church, when we talk to people about the gospel and share the gospel with them, there are things that go beyond this life that can last for eternity, and that can be a big source of encouragement and joy for a believer, for sure. Yeah. So let's get to the conclusion. He's found some initial findings. He's in this place where he basically hates life and hates his toil. But then we're coming to this conclusion in verse 24, right? This is what he concludes after this search for satisfaction. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner, he's given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. What is his conclusion? I think it's this. There can be enjoyment in one's toil that comes from the hand of God. There is an appropriate pleasure, an appropriate seeking after wisdom, an appropriate enjoyment in one's work that comes from the hand of God. But there are a few things that characterize this understanding that's different than what he was trying to do before, I think. So how do we find enjoyment? I think, number one, first, we recognize, like Solomon, that both the toil itself and the possibility of enjoying it come from the hand of God. It's not clear at first that he was trying to find enjoyment in that perspective that God had given him these things to do. Now he's looking at it and he's saying, this also I saw is from the hand of God. There's nothing better than we should eat and drink and find enjoyment because these things come from the hand of God. It's because it's the very possibility of enjoying that comes. And then also the negative aspect, the other side of that coin, is if it weren't for the existence of God, enjoyment would be meaningless. Look what he says after this. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? So he's making this declaration that the very existence of God and the recognition of God is what allows us to have enjoyment. Without him, enjoyment would be meaningless. We would be in the position that he found himself earlier with hating life and hating toil. And then finally, number 3, what's the right perspective on enjoyment and toil? We understand that there's a wisdom given by God to his followers that's incomprehensible to sinners. And this is what he says in verse 26. To the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting. At first it almost seems like he's saying, the followers of God get the good jobs and the sinners get the menial tasks, right? I don't think he's actually saying that. I think it's a perspective on work. It's that to the one who pleases God, to the one that's seeking after God, he gives joy in their labor and wisdom as they learn. But to the one that doesn't, to the sinner who rejects God, he could be doing the same job, but it's like gathering and collecting, right? It's that toil idea that he was mentioning before, that then basically goes to benefit only to give to the one who pleases God, right? And so These three ideas here, I think, are Solomon's first, again, in this enjoyment refrain, this first refrain that he gives us, is his first corrective in this seeking after the meaning of life under the sun. He starts despairing because he's going after pleasure, he's going after toil, wisdom, going after toil, and he starts despairing. These things don't satisfy. There's nothing better for the wise person than the fool. I'm accruing all these things and laboring for them, and then I have to pass it off to someone else, and who knows what they're going to do with it. And he's despairing. But then Solomon, as he's writing this and looking back on his life, he realizes enjoyment comes from God. Toil itself, the toil is given by God, partially given by God in the curse, right? God gave us this hard work. It's even harder because we're in the curse, but he gives us the possibility of enjoying it as well. And so there's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment, to appropriately enjoy the things that God's given to us. So in application, I think a good thing to think about as we're looking at this, how do we navigate the ideas of pleasure and learning and hard work in our minds? I think sometimes we tend to go to one of two extremes. We either binge or we reject, right? So binging is a big thing nowadays, right? We binge on TV shows or binge on food or binge on whatever, right? Binge on pleasure, right? That's the idea that it's enjoying a good thing, but just not being content with the initial enjoyment, but just always wanting more and more. It's that binging. You just can't stop. We binge on knowledge, right? I've been guilty of finding YouTube videos that are educational and just not knowing when to stop with them, right? Maybe most of us don't struggle with binging on knowledge. Maybe you're not like reading 100 books in a day, but we can binge on things like that. Binge on work, workaholic, right? Someone that just can't stop, can't shut it off, always needs to be working. Or we reject, right? We just say, hey, I'm going to reject pleasure altogether. That's known as asceticism, right? You're just saying all pleasure is bad. I'm not gonna enjoy anything because of the temptation that I might have to abuse it, right? Or maybe we reject knowledge. Just say, hey, everything's confusing. The more I learn, the more I don't know. So I'm just not going to work at learning. I'm just going to stick with what I know now and try to make it through. Is that how you? Yeah, that's how you start feeling. Yeah. There you go. Or we reject work, right? We say if it's all vanity, then I'm just not going to do it. Laziness, right? We just say it's not worth it. I'm gonna mooch off of whoever I can or whatever. These are all wrong ways to go about it, right? Both the binging and the rejecting. Rather, I think Solomon tells us here, don't binge on pleasure. There are pleasures, there's enjoyment that come to us naturally from the hand of God. This is something that God allows in his common grace. He allows enjoyment in going about our lives. Enjoy them when they come, right? Don't shrink back from enjoying them, but don't put too much stock in them. Don't grab onto them and try to keep enjoying it once the enjoyment's gone, right? Enjoy the things that naturally come from the hand of God. Understand that they don't satisfy. They're good things, but apart from God, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? They're secondary things. Knowing God is the main thing. He would tell us this: don't seek wisdom simply for the sake of gaining knowledge for yourself. Don't labor as if you'll be able to keep what you've worked for. I did this, and Solomon says, right? I did this and ended up despairing of life and hating my work. Understand there's a good in your labor and that God gives wisdom to his followers. Solomon tells us this in this first refrain that we looked at. Pleasure, wisdom, and toil, understood rightly, are opportunities to enjoy the hand of God, right? If we understand it rightly, it can actually be part of our fellowship with God, enjoying the things that come from his hand. Think of that verse in James, right? Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. When we enjoy the world that he's given to us in an appropriate way, it's part of our fellowship with God. Enjoy them, but don't set your heart on them. They're a vapor. Think back to that quote from the beginning. Breathe in, now breathe out, and life will pass by just that quickly. Does it make it meaningless? No. Does it make it difficult, hard to understand? Yeah. and we can enjoy it appropriately, the life that God has given to us. But understand that we don't set our hope ultimately on this life. I want to close again, like I did last week with a psalm. I want to go to Psalm 62 and close with a few verses from Psalm 62 tonight. We'll start in verse 5. It says this, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory, my mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are altogether lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render a man according to his work." So reflecting here on the goodness of taking refuge and waiting in God alone, to understand that the riches may come, pleasure may come at times, but to not set your hope on those things. And to remember that life, as we've been reflecting on in Ecclesiastes, life here is but a breath, right? The life that God's given to us. And so let's number our days and have a heart of wisdom, right, in it. So that is the first section. The first section that I wanted to get through in Ecclesiastes. We get to this idea of enjoyment. Next week, we want to spend some time looking at a reflection on time and eternity in Ecclesiastes 3. So that's what we'll be going to next week, Lord willing. All right? Thanks for your time, and thanks for your attention. Let's close in a word of prayer, and we'll be done tonight. Lord, we're thankful that you, in your grace to us, you give us good things in life to enjoy, even among the difficult things, even among the difficulties in life, that when we know you and we've trusted in you and we're seeking after you, that we can find enjoyment in the things that you give us to do, even here in this life. And I pray that you would help us to enjoy things appropriately with an attitude of thankfulness, that we would see you in them. And God, I pray that you would keep us from hearts that reach out for things of this temporal life and want to be ultimately satisfied in them. Help us to seek our satisfaction in you and you alone, in knowing you and fearing you. And so I pray that you do that in our hearts, that you would draw us closer to you. Thank you for your word and for the opportunity to be together tonight. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, if you'd like to take a moment of prayer, we'd encourage you to do that. Find someone to pray with. There's prayer bulletins right over there on the high top tables. Take those home with you too, and be praying for each other throughout the week. And we'll see you Sunday at 9:30 or 10:30, Lord willing. See you then.